We're going to repeal and absolutely repeal and replace ObamaCare.
Repeal and replace Obamacare.
Repeal and replace Obamacare. Repeal and replace Obamacare with something so much better.
So we've heard it a few times, right? Repeal and replace, a familiar refrain heard all through the presidential campaign. But Republican lawmakers are coming to grips with how difficult it will be to unravel the sprawling health care legislation and are considering a repeal and delay approach instead. Perhaps. We'll see right now. David Goodfriend is a former deputy staff secretary to President Clinton. Ed Rollins was the director of President Reagan's reelection campaign, principal White House advisor to President Reagan, and he's also a Fox News political analyst. Ed, let me start with you. Let's just talk about the politics of this just as we look ahead to the new year. How much time do Republicans have to get something together if indeed they have another option to Obamacare? How quickly does it need to be up and running for the public?
I think it needs to be up and running pretty quickly. I think it's a very complicated issue, and obviously they can repeal it quickly. They've already done that a number of times. But the replacement part of it is where the difficulty is. And whatever we do at this point in time, we'd like to do with some bipartisan support. We'd like to make sure that the system that you end up with here is something that people will be satisfied. Nobody is satisfied right now with Obamacare. The costs are record high, that you don't get to keep your doctors, hospitals. The original plan didn't bring anything to bring the cost down. And I think to a certain extent, the cost of small businesses, the cost of big businesses, the cost for insurance is enormous.
David, your thoughts?
Well, I think that Ed said something very important here. He's hoping that Democrats vote with Republicans on some of this, and there's a real political reason for that. When he was chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel warned President Obama, if we pass this thing, we get blamed for anything and everything that goes wrong with someone's health care, and that is true for Republicans as well. Democrats are out of power now. So if Republicans touch it, they get blamed for somebody's insurance problem, somebody's doctor problem, whatever it is. The Republicans touch it, they own it. And that's why I think Ed saying, I'm hoping that we get some Democratic votes is very wise. I think if I were in his seat, I would too.
David, would you say that was a mistake, though, looking back on it, because Democrats went ahead without any sort of bipartisan support at all, not even one little Republican, sorry, not little, but, you know, in general, coming across the lines, that forever hurt the legislation?
I think what it meant was that, as I said, anything that went wrong, Republicans could just say, well, I didn't vote for it, it's not my problem. And the problem, the political problem Republicans have now is that 20 million people have gotten insurance as a result of Obamacare. What about them? You know, somebody I know and respect very well, his name is Chris Ruddy. He's the CEO of conservative site Newsmax. He wrote recently, President Obama won the argument that coverage was a problem. We have to cover people. Now Republicans have to answer how they would do it. And Mr. Ruddy suggests that maybe Medicaid is the way to look at that, which is filled with ironies. But the point is, 20 million people, one way or another, are going to point to Republicans and say, you took that away from me, or you fixed a problem. And I think it's the latter that Republicans want. It's just very complicated.
And just to underscore, Medicaid, the expansion of Medicaid has been huge under Obamacare. And that's why some are looking at it and saying, okay, Medicaid's expanded. Perhaps the Medicaid expansion stays because it has nothing to do with the private market, and at least it'll cover some of the people that were absorbed into it.
Except it's an enormous cost to states. And the reality is most of these states that took it because the federal government was going to pay for it for a 5-year period. I think the critical thing here is when to get one fix. We can't keep doing this every 2 years, every 4 years, every 6 years. So I would hope that they take the time, again, do whatever they have to do politically to repeal it, at least emotionally set that in play. But I think it needs to be carefully thought through that this is a plan that's going to be here for a long time, just as Medicare and Medicaid. Some minor adjustments that may need to be made, but this really is the major overhaul, and you've got to make sure it works. Got to make sure it works for doctors. You've got to make sure it works for hospitals. Got to make sure it works for the insurance companies. Got to make sure it works for the employers, and certainly most important of all is for the patients. And I think that's going to take time, and it needs to be done carefully and effectively and with bipartisan support.
Well, and the question is the timing again. We all have seen if you do get health insurance through your company, or you were getting it through Obamacare as well, you had this open enrollment period. So we're all essentially signed up if you have insurance through the end of next year, David. But after that, there's a big concern. You know, next November, do we see something different? So is that really the timeline you're looking at? And where do you see Democrats joining Republicans in some of these efforts?
Well, first of all, let's be clear. Most of Americans always did and still do receive their health insurance through their employer. So we're talking about as I said, not a majority of Americans who are impacted by these changes, but a significant number of them, and ironically, many Trump voters. I mean, a lot of the counties that went for Trump are places where Obamacare has resulted in increases in coverage. Now, as far as timing goes, I think that regardless of whether or not the Republicans in Congress put a long fuse on the sunsetting of certain provisions, like if they say, don't worry, nothing's going to happen for 3 years, I'd still go back to my original statement. You touch it, you own it. Anything that happens in health care at that point could be blamed on some action in Congress. I think Democrats are gettable for Republicans if the coverage element is maintained. That is, if you say, all right, the people who are covered today will remain covered, we're not going to pull the rug out from under them, a lot of Democrats would be willing to work with you on making the program better.
Ed, weigh in on that, because there's having coverage and then there's liking coverage, the coverage that you're getting. And the difference between that seems to be at the core of the issue about what to do with health care right now.
Well, equally as important, the problem always has been health care. When you have young 25, 30-year-old people, adults who are not sick, and they don't want to spend the enormous amount of money it costs for health insurance. They'd rather put their money somewhere else. So by the mandates and other things, we've tried to force people into a system that they're not very happy with. So somehow you've got to basically, and again, I think it's not just the bipartisan support, it's bringing all elements of the health provider system into the play, and each of them now has had a system in play for 4 or 5 years. They know what doesn't work, they know what does work, and I think at the point in time of redrawing another bill, and I don't care whether it's a Republican bill or a Democrat bill, I mean, it's going to be a Republican bill, obviously, but I think with bipartisan support, it has to fix the health care problems for the long term, and that's got to be the goal.
Are you both optimistic? I mean, quickly, David, are you? I mean, are you optimistic? Ed, are you optimistic that this could be better, that next year at this time we might have something different?
It can be better. I'm convinced of that, and I think David would say the same. We now know what didn't work, we know what needs to be fixed, and I think that's the critical thing here.
David?
Henry Waxman, who chaired the Energy and Commerce Committee when this thing passed, said, never before have we passed something this complex and not gone back to fix it and make it better. I think Democrats would be anxious for that opportunity.
All right, well, we'll see. David, thank you very much. David, Ed, great to have you both. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.